men and women of Australia, we are at war with Japan.
I should have got it going up there, you know. I really should have. There were so many acts of bravery there.
Like the rest of us, to stay there and fight to the finish.
G'day, David Howell here from Kokoda Historical, and welcome to the second episode of Kokoda Kast. If you've just tuned in, make sure you check into True Blue History as well, who's very graciously hosting our talk series. This is all about Kokoda and Papua New Guinea, and in particular, the year 1942. I'm very happy today to be joined by an old friend of mine, Gary Traynor, who runs the website that many will be familiar with, Medals Gone Missing. He's done a lot of work in the Kokoda space, but in particular he does a lot of work with getting items that have numbers and names of soldiers, of veterans, and reuniting them with the family. And he's had some success in particular with some medals. So welcome, Gary.
Good morning, David. It's wonderful to join you today.
Great. Now today I thought, because I want to have you on the show a few times in the course of Kokoda Kast, but today I want to talk about, only from the Australian perspective, the equipment. Obviously, a lot of Australians go and trek the Kokoda track these days, and they would have all the most modern gear you could imagine, walking poles and vibrant sole boots and lycra and all that sort of stuff. But let's go back and look at the campaign and look at the equipment that the Australian soldiers had and how it developed in the course of 1942. So where would you like to start, Gary?
Well, look, you've just made a very valid point in terms of the modern equipment compared to what was born in 1942. David, you know more than anyone that the Kokoda track is hard enough to do just on its own, but you start throwing in things such as chafing and freezing cold and blisters on your feet and things such as that, which we tend to avoid now with regards to this modern stuff. I mean, just walking the track in that 1942 gear was an ordeal in itself.
Indeed, and I think what we might do, we'll start from the ground up. Let's start from the boots going up and as it developed over the campaign. I know that you've written a wonderful article about boots on the Kokoda track, which is also on the Kokoda Historical website and the Medals Gone Missing website. So let's start off with the boots.
Great place to start.
So it's my understanding going in to the Kokoda campaign, in particular the militia guys, so the 39th from here in Victoria and the 53rd from up your way in New South Wales, those guys, when they first arrived, just before the Kokoda campaign started off, what sort of boots were they wearing?
Well, certainly, David, as you'd be aware, that the boots they were wearing were the first pattern boots. I mean, when we go back to when the ARF was formed, in 1914, Charles Bean himself in his official history states that the Australian-made boots, what he classed simply as being a workman's style boot, were very comfortable, very favoured, and even British troops looked upon their boots with such envy. So, having said that, the boots which the Australians wore, certainly up until 1941, were exclusively that first pattern style boot, very similar to the First World War boot.
Yeah, and what do we know about the soles of the boot? Because one of the things that we always hear about with trekkers is, asking what footwear, what sort of grip do they need, what sort of ankle support that they need. But it's my understanding that those early boots had simply a smooth sole.
Look, absolutely, and this is what people tend to forget. Again, you mentioned modern boots before with all these marvellous treads. The Australian boot, of course, was just simply a flat leather sole. There is evidence of steel heel plates, and there would certainly have been, on occasion, there some steel toe caps. When I say toe caps, I mean the small plate which is underneath the toe, so in contact with the ground. But I've certainly found numerous heel plates which would indicate that there was some metal work on the bottom. But when collectors buy boots in this day and age, or surplus World War II boots, they've often got those brass jungle cleats on the sole, and they were definitely not, to my knowledge, involved in the Kokoda campaign at all. In fact, probably implemented as a result of lessons learned on Kokoda.
Exactly, and it's my understanding that I have never seen anywhere in PNG, not just on Kokoda, but including the latter campaigns, say in the Ramu Valley or even towards the end of the war up in Rebel, I've never once seen in all of those collections that the locals have, museum type collections where you pay your kina and you go and have a look at. I've never once seen one of those brass cleats. So it seems to me Australian soldiers going in to the Kokoda campaign in 1942 really had hard leather ankle type boot And yes, you're right with the metal fittings on the toe and the small horseshoe for the heel plate, but the sole itself was quite smooth, which we all know trekking Kokoda would have been enormous difficulty doing it in those boots.
Look, absolutely. If I could just make a couple of points there, people often talk about the golden staircase. Where is the golden staircase, and can we walk on the golden staircase? The fact of the matter is the golden staircase was just simply man-made stairs, and as the engineers progressed forward on the Kokoda Trail, of course, they implemented or put these stairs in to make it a bit easier for the carriers and for the troops to negotiate the steep inclines. But if you can just imagine a round log or a round piece of timber cut from the jungle, which becomes wet and sodden with the water, and then trying to step up onto that round piece of timber with a flat leather sole. It would have been extremely slippery. You can imagine how many shins were scuffed or hit on the front of those treads, because these boots were flat leather soles, and again, extremely slippery in the wet.
Well, in 2017, for the 75th anniversary of the kickoff of Kokoda, I, as you know, walked across the track with a group of Australians dressed in period kit, and we sourced the period kit from as many places and as close. It wasn't 100%, but it was very close, and as close as you would get, I believe. And we bought the boots from Lawrence Ordnance in Sydney, and they were, the First World War pattern boot with completely smooth leather. It actually had no fittings on it. Some of us got a toe plate and the heel. And I can tell you, after doing Kokoda in them, whilst the boot and the leather wasn't too bad, it was more comfortable than I thought. In terms of slipping and going downhill, you were on your bum more so than when I've trekked Kokoda with with proper soles.
And look, for anyone who has walked in any direction, there's a couple of hills there which are damn near vertical. In fact, the hill coming up from Offie Creek when you're heading south towards Iribira itself, just coming out of the river there, it's extremely steep, and I've actually once had to do that section in water shoes, flat rubber-soled water shoes, and I had zero traction at all. So I can only imagine you and your crew certainly battled it out with those leather-soled boots.
Indeed. And so let's move up from the boot, because the boot doesn't really evolve that much. Would you agree in terms of the Kokoda campaign? You already mentioned that the brass metal cleats, which is probably more than likely came out of the lessons learned in New Guinea, and you start to see them on boots dated 44, 45 towards the end of the war. But for Kokoda, I think am I right in saying the only evolution really in the boot was that you start to see the next pattern of boot, which has a harder toe cap on it with cross stitching going across it, and you can still see remnants of that type of leather up there on the track.
Look, indeed, and that's so correct. In fact, the only remnant boots I've seen in any sort of private museum or any collection which the Papuans own up there on the trail were that later pattern, what they class in the Army PAMs as pattern 10085, which is just a term for, it's the boots with the stitching, as you say, across the toe. And there's numerous examples, as you know, in particular the Japanese mountain gun position above Yora Creek, for example, is one place where I've actually seen a boot almost pristine in its suppleness. The leather was still coloured a nice tan colour and quite supple, but purely supple because it's never dried out. It's been completely saturated since 1942. So that one particular pair, David, which I'm sure you've seen, the stitching has rotted off, but the leather is still intact. And again, so the boots which we do tend to find now is that pattern 10085, and that's no doubt due to the fact that one perhaps 21st Brigade, 25th Brigade, even 16th Brigade were possibly resupplied prior to going up on the track, or they're just the boots that were simply dropped in large quantities by the airdrops around Waiwala and Naro.
Indeed, and I know that from my own collection I have a pair dated 1941 that has the cross stitch, whereas my boots prior to that I've got two pairs without the cross stitch, and both are dated 1940. Okay, let's move on from the boot now. Let's move up the leg. What in addition to the boot, because they're ankle boots, you see the photographs of soldiers back here at home with all different types of gaiters or some sort of small, short putties are called, and then you see in Kokoda with the American gaiters. And what would you say were the type of leggings that the Australians wore, and why did you think they came about that way?
Well, it's funny, I guess, any protection on your leg, especially when you're wearing shorts in the jungle, would be sought after. I mean, there's nothing worse than getting minor cuts and scrapes, which then could fester into tropical ulcers. So, of course, many troops did try their best to acquire or wear whatever legging they possibly could. So, in the early parts of the campaign, it's not uncommon to see men with bare legs, I mean, wearing shorts, but they're also wearing the 1903 pattern leather legging, what collectors colloquially call and incorrectly call light horse leggings. I mean, obviously, they're just simply the mounted pattern leather legging, which has the strap that wraps around. There's more than one photo on the Australian War Memorial website, and also Damien Parra's footage, where you see these men wearing these leather leggings with bare legs.
Yeah.
So they're certainly prevalent in the early parts of the campaign. But again, look at those same photos and the same footage from Damien Parra. Some blokes are wearing nothing at all on their legs. I've certainly never seen a photograph of a man wearing the short puttees, which were, I guess, a derivative of the First World War puttees, which were 9 feet long. Well, Australia had a very short putty, which again purely stopped mud and dirt from going down, between the sock and the boot. I've never seen that, even though they were certainly around in that era. And I've never really seen much evidence of there being pattern 37 gaiters, which, as you know, David, is the same material as the belts and the haversacks, for example, that woven cotton type material, which were deemed useless by troops in the desert. So I can imagine they were just as useless in the jungle.
Yeah, and look, a lot of the photos that I've looked at for the early pre-Kokoda deployment, if you will, so before the troops moved up to New Guinea, and in particular I've got some great images of the 39th Battalion doing their training at Darley out near Bacchus Marsh here in Victoria. And in the photo, it looks like they've got what you suspect to see early war for Australian soldiers, which are those wool 3-button type closure on them. And they're just a wool made like the service dress tunic. They're a wool putty or gaiter, if you will. But I've never not seen them. They obviously had them, but I've never seen a photo of them. And I just think that they obviously would have chafed, or they would have been inappropriate for the jungle environment.
Yeah, you can imagine once the wool got wet, they certainly just would have been more of a hindrance than a help. Plus the fact that, sewn on buttons sewn into a woolen body would not last, like 2 or 3 days in the jungle.
No. So back to when I did my trek in all the gear, we had the short putties because they were commercially available, but they went in the backpack, and we simply just rolled the sock down over the top of the ankle boot. And, I think that the most of the photographs that you'd look at Kokoda, that's pretty much for the early part of Kokoda, as you just see men with their socks rolled. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, look, I definitely agree on that. And look, I mean, when we start to really get into the nitty gritty of the campaign, let's talk about the time just after the pulling or the withdrawal from Isarava. Look, many authors have written of the time when the 2nd 14th fell back to the position at Myola itself, the Myola dropping ground, in particular on the 3rd of September. So when the 2nd 14th camped there on that night and woke up on the morning of the 4th of September, it's been described, I think, in Peter Broun, if not Bill James, that they woke up to a promised land. I mean, there was fresh boots, fresh socks, fresh everything, and they speak about men cutting off or ripping off rotten uniforms and putting on brand new uniforms. In particular, mention was given to a Corporal Clark, who was the unit chiropodist, who was paring away pieces of rotten tissue from feet, because these men hadn't had their shoes off for a matter of weeks. So you can imagine socks, anything woolen of that nature, certainly had a lifetime, or a lifespan, I should say, on the Kokoda Trail due to the moisture and just the heavy wear and tear of walking up and down hills. Indeed.
And before we move on to the uniforms, just to finish off on the gaiters, or the leggings, if you will. So we mentioned that the Pattern 03, the leather, certainly there's plenty of pictures of 39th guys. I can't remember who said it, but one of the 39th veterans told me that they didn't last a day. They threw them away because of the chafing and the fact that they just, once they got wet, they're inappropriate. But there were higher legging types that were introduced, and you see in the photographs later on in the Kokoda campaign, which are the United States Army ones. Let's talk about that quickly.
Indeed, in fact, you're coming onto a subject which is very close to my heart, and that's the 25th Brigade, the 2nd 33rd Battalion in particular, of which I am a life member, I'm pleased to say. So the Foot Soldiers was written by Bill Crooks after the war. It's perhaps one of the most revered or most sought after of unit histories, and he particularly writes of the fact that the 2nd 33rd Battalion, when they went up to their deployment position prior to going onto the trail, they exchanged their khaki clothing for freshly dyed green clothing, and acquired the new American gaiter, which, though rather technical to try and put on, I mean, it's an elaborate system of laces and a strap which goes underneath the arch of your foot. I think once this type of legging was in place, it was very much favoured by the Australian troops, especially if you were wearing long trousers. It managed to contain the bottom of the trouser so that the leg of the trouser itself wouldn't come out when compared, for example, to the Pattern 37 gaiter, which I thought would have no capability at all of retaining the leg of the trouser leg inside the gaiter itself. Yes, I certainly think that the American Army gaiter was a preferred item of use, especially when you see it also being used in the 1943, 44 and 45 campaigns. Obviously it had that longevity, so it must have been practical and handy to have.
Yeah, indeed. So really, the evolution of the footwear and the gaiter system seems to be an ad hoc basis, and I think really when you look at it, you'd rightly say that we didn't really have the greatest of footwear for Kokoda, and I don't have a statistic at hand, but as you rightly said before and gave the account of the doctor removing flesh when the boots come off, we were really behind the back foot, so to speak, in relation to footwear on the Kokoda track.
Yeah, well, as they say in Kokoda, 2 steps forward and 3 steps back.
Indeed.
Especially going up those hills, mate. So, yeah, look, without a doubt. I mean, and compare our footwear to the American footwear, which had rubber soles. I'd be very keen to walk the trail in both. I know you've walked the trail in those old boots, but I don't think I'm that hard. So I think I might just stick with my high techs.
Excellent. Now let's move on to the uniforms. Let's get away from the footwear for a second, and I think this is probably something that most people who have interacted with Kokoda in way of reading a book or have been up there, and they all hear the story of, the Australian soldiers went in there underprepared, ill-equipped, and they went in there wearing, khaki uniforms, which was great for the desert, but not for the jungle, whilst the Japanese, of course, their enemy that they were facing, was wearing jungle green uniforms. So let's talk about the sort of uniforms that the Australian soldier wore on Kokoda. Obviously, they didn't wear their wool service dress uniforms, but what were they wearing up there, Gary?
Okay, so again, those early troops, the 39th Battalion from Victoria, the 53rd from New South Wales, and in particular the 3rd Battalion, the 3rd Militia Battalion from New South Wales, all were issued with and wore on the trail the khaki cotton clothing, which is fantastic for India. It's great for the desert, but it's certainly no good for the jungle green background. You can imagine it was a huge contrast. Certainly the 2nd 14th Battalions and the 2nd 16th both left, let's say Port Moresby, for want of a better place, the Sigeri Plateau. They left there in khakis, but quite interesting. I went through an old video many years ago called Kokoda Stairway to Hell, and it had a partial interview between two chaps. One was identified as Lieutenant J.R. Mackenzie, and the other one was Corporal A.J. Smith, and they were both 2nd 16th Battalion. And just as a throwaway comment, Smith stated that they'd been issued with khaki clothing before they started off down the track, but had to dye their clothes green at Myola. And then at that stage, J.R. Mackenzie, the officer, he stated that when they got wet, the dye ran down their clothing, from their clothing and down their legs, causing pimples on their skin from the chemicals. So that was really the first solid evidence I had that yes, certainly whilst the 2nd, 16th or 21st Brigade would have left Kokoda in khakis, they were possibly in greens almost to a man by the stage they got to Isarava on the 26th of August. So that cotton khaki clothing was one that was completely unsuitable for the jungle. And I do note that in particular the 3rd Battalion, the 3rd Militia Battalion, they remained in khaki throughout the entire Kokoda campaign. They weren't once resupplied with greens, I believe, until they reached Kokoda itself on the 3rd of November.
So really, we're talking, if we go back a step there, so the militia guys, the first guys like the 39th, the 53rd, they're going up there. You see the photos of them, and they're wearing almost a King G looking khaki uniform, which consisted of a shirt with half button shirt, 4 buttons down the front with their 2 pockets, and their sleeves rolled up, had a collar on it obviously, and it's usually you see them tucked into to shorts and a khaki again. And I can just imagine that if you're having to do, both you and I have done some reserve service, and if you have to in the infantry, and if you're doing fire and movement on your guts and, leopard crawling, all that sort of stuff, you just imagine what the terrain and the ground on the jungle floor would have done to your elbows and to your knees.
Oh, look, absolutely. And as you know, David, any cut in the jungle, if not cared for, can become a tropical ulcer. The thing is with that khaki, it's true that when this stuff got saturated or wet, it did take on a darker shade. But in terms of the actual colour itself, and as you mentioned, men crawling on their stomachs, I've got no doubt that that the mud and the dirt of Kokoda helped somewhat to darken or camouflage the uniform. Yeah, somewhat just through natural progression. But certainly when you compare it to the Japanese, who were in jungle greens and had been wearing jungle greens in other campaigns, we were certainly ill prepared compared to the Japanese army.
And do we know when it starts to become common for Australian soldiers to have the jungle green uniform? I know within my own collection I've got a couple of pieces which are over-dyed khaki stuff. They've got early dates on them, 1942 for example, but I do have what you can see manufactured, because the stitching has obviously not been dyed and the labels in them are not dyed, so they've been manufactured in the jungle green, and I start to see that around 43, and then on 44, 45 onwards you can get it. But as my understanding that the Australian soldier uniform, at first there was from command there was no idea that it would make any benefit in the jungle. Then the men start to dye them. Obviously the dye runs, that it's not great, it's not manufactured that way, but obviously at some point that the Australian Army decides that, well, hang on a second, we need to develop stuff for the jungle, and they start to manufacture. They start to have manufacturing here in Australia, making uniforms.
Yeah, well, that's true. So look, I guess two parts or two answers to that question. So as we know, the Battle for Isharava starts on the 26th of August for the 21st Brigade. So we know that the 2nd 16th and 2nd 14th had uniforms dyed in Myola itself. So that's easily very mid August, and certainly by the 9th of September, the following month, when the 2nd 33rd and 25th Brigade are going up the trail, they too are starting to wear dyed green clothing. So in terms of the manufacturing process, I've never seen in 30 years of collecting purposely manufactured jungle greens with a date prior to 1943. So I think you're quite right, David. I mean, 43 onwards seems to be the magic date for acquiring purpose-built jungle green clothing. But in the collector world, which goes on in this day and age, I mean, there's still so many uniforms out there, jungle green uniforms, which have been over-dyed. I mean, they were once khaki or manufactured as khaki, and the jungle green dyeing process has eliminated perhaps any signs of the date of manufacture. So it's quite interesting to note, I think, that there's probably more uniforms out there which have been over-dyed than there are uniforms which have a manufacturer's date. But that's purely due to the fact too that we had 3 years of war, from 1943 through to 1945, where we simply used up all stocks of uniform.
And Gary, indeed, we have some wonderful accounts from the veterans themselves. Now, take for example Arthur Smith, who was a member of the 2nd 16th Battalion of the 21st Brigade, and he talks about not only dyeing his uniform, but what happens, of course, when the dye comes off. Let's take a listen.
Nobody told us.
You know khaki clothes, remember?
No, yeah,
and they got green bloody dye, and we dyed our clothes, and as soon as you got wet, all the dye ran out.
They were like Biola, wasn't
You had heliotrope sort of clothes, plus a big string of pimples all over your legs into the bargain, where the dye affected your skin in some cases.
That's right.
I mean, that
was at Myola we
today,
got.
walking around these beautiful camouflage suits and everything, you'd have given your life.
Yeah.
Well, probably some poor sons did.
Yeah, I'm just looking as we're talking now in that book that you mentioned before, which is The Foot Soldiers, the history of the 2nd 33rd Battalion. And in the book, and I'm going to read this, it talks about dyeing the uniform, and it says, to give the audience background, this is before these guys are about to march up off the track, it's a march onto the track, I should say. And it says in the history, it says, in an atmosphere of urgency, we hurried about sorting stores, issuing ammunition, and changing our khaki drill for green dyed drill, the first AIF troops to do so. These greens were being dyed in Sawyer stoves which had been set up by the 21st Brigade men, supervised by Australian Army Ordnance Corps men. One simply stripped naked, moved over to a Sawyer issue point, dumped one's own car keys, picked up equivalent sizes, wet or dry, and put them on. Now, that's quite interesting. A Sawyer stove, for those who don't know, is you can imagine like a 44-gallon drum, I guess, with a flute coming up off the back of it. This is really interesting stuff. These guys are about to go off onto Kokoda into battle, and they're literally taking their khaki drill off and just picking up any any dyed uniforms, I should say, that have been left for them.
It is. It's a real moment of desperation. It just simply shows that we are learning as an army. Again, you would be the first to support me by saying that lessons learnt on Kokoda really formed the basis for the Canungrel Jungle Training School. That came into fruition after the Kokoda campaign. So, without any doubt in the world, I mean, we were learning very fast, and I'm very, very pleased to say that the Jungle Green had a fairly good life in terms of Australian campaigns. When you consider they were in vogue during the Malayan emergency, but of course the song made famous by Red Gum, I was only 19, that I was standing there with my SLR and greens. I mean, so Jungle Greens remained in service well into the 80s.
Yeah, and as you say, it's a lesson learnt from jungle warfare. In fact, another episode in this series, we will have Adrian Threlfall on, who wrote the book Jungle Warriors, who talks about the Army doctrine moving from desert warfare into the jungle. So here we are, we've got the uniform that we've looked at. So you've got a mixture of guys on the Kokoda in khaki and jungle green or dyed jungle greens, and some have got shorts on, some have got trousers on, some have got socks rolled down over the boots, others have got the American gaiters, depending on what time of the campaign. So let's move on from that, and we'll go up to the head now. Let's talk about headdress. So you've got many pictures of guys on Kokoda, and it seems to be either two types of headdress: your tin hat, the Australian helmet, or a slouch hat. Let's discuss this, Gary.
Okay, it's funny you should bring that up. I mentioned before that that old DVD, the old video Stairway to Hell, or Kokoda Stairway to Hell, and Corporal Smith, the gentleman who's in the interview with his officer J.R. Mackenzie, he makes a strange comment where he said that they gave us tin hats or steel helmets, and that was a no-no in the jungle. And the video, or the way the video is made, it's cut, so there's no explanation to that term as to why it would be a no-no to wear a helmet in the jungle. I mean, my only thought on that would be the extreme heat. I mean, as you know, Kokoda, in certain places, when you get out from underneath the jungle canopy, is extremely hot. I mean, the sun is striking, and you can imagine the heat caused by having a tin hat on your head, or more correctly, a Brody pattern helmet, a Mark II helmet. So, without any doubt in the world, that's the only thing I could feel would be the negative side to wearing a helmet. Again, there's more than one photo of many campaigns where men have suffered or impacts upon their head, dints in their helmets from bullets and the like. So I think I'd rather have the steel helmet on in a foxhole than a slouch hat. But there's just no doubt in the mind the khaki fur felt hat would have been the much preferred headwear in terms of the extreme heat.
Indeed, and just while we're talking on the steel helmet, there's 2 points that I'm going to bring up. The first one is I know that when the 39th Battalion, in particular B Company, who were the first of the Australian units to go over, and of course they famously met the PIB as the Japanese had come to land on the shores of Papua, but those men, it's my understanding, and when we did the reenactment of it, they wore slouch hats, but their heavier stores were brought round in the schooner the Gilly Gilly, and among them were their steel helmets. And so you get a account in the history later on when the 39th are digging in on the Kokoda Plateau that's actually what they're using. They're using their helmets to dig in. So it seems safe to say that the Australian soldiers' headdress were either your slouch hat or your tin hat, or maybe very much likely that men would have had both on their person.
Look, without a doubt too. I mean, weight is the vital factor. I do recall one interview many years ago with Bede Tongs, who was a 10 platoon commander in the 3rd Battalion, and he simply said weight was so critical he had to choose between carrying a spoon or a fork. So I can imagine if a chap did have a helmet and a hat, he may consider one or the other to be excessive weight. But I've got no doubt in the world that men on occasion carried both the slouch hat and the tin hat and just wore them whenever the times were appropriate.
Yeah, and I just want to talk about the tin helmet for a moment, because we, almost always recognisable what an American helmet looks like, and that carried on, from the Second World War onwards. But let's talk about the steel helmet and the evolution of it. And I know that you know a little bit about this, Gary, and it takes us back to 1916.
Yes, well, again, I mean, the Brodie pattern helmet was introduced, for the Brits in 1915, but certainly not to the Australians until 1916. And it certainly, it was an essential part of any sort of frontline uniform. Simple reason being, again, it didn't offer direct protection. Like if a bullet was to strike you flush on the helmet, it was a very good chance of being penetrated. But certainly glancing blows and that could be minimalised by having the helmet on. So when the helmet comes through, it goes from the Mark I in the First War through to the Mark II in the early stage of the Second World War, and then becomes the Mark III. So there were slight modifications made, generally in the liners. The First World War liners were vastly different to that of the Second World War. The Second World War liners, I would suggest, are far better or more resilient in jungle conditions, in particular due to the fact that they're mostly just rubber. So having said that, the steel helmets, certainly Mark IIs and Mark IIIs would have been on the Kokoda Trail. In fact, in a trip a couple of years back when it was the 75th anniversary of the Kokoda campaign for the 2nd 33rd Battalion, one of my group, Matthew Sloan, who's a life member of the association, actually found the bales on an Australian helmet. So if you can just imagine, David, the bales, for those who don't know, are the small stainless steel fixtures on each side of the helmet. Imagine where your temples would be, which simply holds on an elasticized cotton chin strap. So whilst the chin strap was long gone and the helmet had crumbled to dust, or it was completely rusty and you couldn't pick this thing up without it falling to bits, the helmet bales had survived, and of course they bore the stamping of Mark III, MK3, and bore the date of 1942. So it was a nice little find, in particular on Myola Ridge, where 2nd 33rd fought, for someone who's a member of a life member of the association to have found this helmet bale. And David, the thing is, as you've no doubt witnessed yourself, the Australian helmet, in terms of its metal, the composure of the helmet, does not last in the jungle as well as the Japanese helmet.
No, you're right, and you very rarely see a full Australian helmet. In fact, I think I can only remember seeing a couple that you could make out that it was the Australian helmet. You certainly find those bales, but by comparison, the Japanese helmets, if anyone walks through any of those villages that have the little museums on Kokoda, you usually pick those up. And as a side note, the American helmets, you find them down at the northern beachheads, and I've certainly seen a lot of them still intact in the battlefields, not just in New Guinea, but also in Guadalcanal. Back to the helmet though, and the design of it and the origin of it, it's my understanding that the basic design of it was medieval in a sense.
Indeed, it is. If you watch the old film with Mel Gibson, Braveheart, you'll see the British troops in that fort scene where William Wallace went and extracted revenge on the Brits. They're wearing a helmet which is very similar, much broader in the brim, of course, but very similar to what would become the Brodie pattern helmet of the First World War.
So I guess back in the First World War, when the helmet came about, easy to make, stamped out of a flat sheet of metal. But obviously when they were new to modern warfare, then the helmet design, they had to look to history. And it's my understanding, not to harp too much on this, but the guy John Brodie, who invented the helmet, would have obviously looked into history for inspiration, I guess, to design the helmet.
Without a doubt in the world. Compare the British helmet, for example, to the German helmet. Perhaps the German helmet was perhaps one of the best designs to come out of the Second World War, dating back to the First World War, in that it offered some limited protection to the back of the neck, whereas the Brodie pattern helmet is level throughout its entire brim. The German helmet, as you know, drops down a little bit over the ears and protects somewhat a part of the back of the neck. And that design, there is certainly traces of that in the modern day ballistic helmets that you see troops and police wearing around the world.
Indeed, but I have to be reminded, and you mentioned it earlier, there are accounts, and I've got pictures in my mind now of seeing photographs of men in all theatres, Australian soldiers in the Second World War, that is, with stories to tell about it. And I'm going back to the wonderful history of the foot soldiers, the 2nd 33rd Battalion history. There is an account in here, And it says this, it says, Corporal McKay's steel helmet was pierced dead centre at the front, but the bullet ricocheted right around his head and emerged from it at an angle above his left eye, miraculously not breaking the skin, but rendering him unconscious from the tremendous blow. That's amazing. So they obviously worked. They obviously worked, Gary.
Without any doubt in the world. I mean, there's certainly some remarkable survival stories there. But look, interesting, when you compare again, let's look at the Kokoda helmets, the Australian Brody pattern helmet versus the Japanese Type 32 helmet. I read many years ago that wherever you have a hole or something similar where a fixture would go through your helmet, it causes a weak point. In particular, I'm talking about the Japanese helmet, and they had the Japanese star at the front
Yes.
for the army. Of course, there was anchors on the front for the Special Naval Landing Forces. But it's interesting that the Imperial War Museum claimed that the Type 32 was of a poor grade steel and susceptible to shattering or being easily pierced by gunfire or shrapnel. Again, they had that small hole at the front where the star was fixed to the actual helmet. Compare that also to the French Adrian style helmet, where they had the I'm not too sure what they call it, but the piece on top which gave it extra support or rigidity on the crown of the helmet itself. And again, that caused a weak point due to the fact that there was holes drilled through the helmet itself to take rivets, in the construction of the helmet. So it's interesting that whilst the Imperial War Museum claims that they were of poor quality steel, we did mention that the Japanese helmets seem to survive the rusty conditions, the moist conditions on the Kokoda Trail when compared to the Brody helmet. So, it's amazing. You could certainly have a whole podcast simply on helmets, I think, David.
I think you and I could have a whole podcast on any one piece of kit. Now, Gary, for the listener back home, because you and I obviously have all of this stuff in our head, for the listeners out there, I am going to also offer this with with like a YouTube clip that'll have the boots, the equipment, the uniforms, examples that are in the collection for people to see in full colour. So let's move on from the helmet. And let's go back down onto the main body, which is something that I know is close to the heart of trekkers, because when trekkers come and walk Kokoda, they are worrying all the time. What equipment? Is it enough? What do I take? What do I have on us? Let's talk about the equipment that the Australian soldiers had on Kokoda, Gary.
Okay, so the basic webbing of the time, and it was the same throughout most of the Second World War, is the pattern 37 webbing. Of course, there's certainly photographic evidence of Australian troops, especially those who left early to go to the Middle East or to England, for example, wearing the 1908 pattern or the British pattern First World War style webbing. But certainly on the Kokoda Trail, the pattern 37 webbing is the most prevalent. And it's a very, very simple design centered around a belt and a set of braces of which things are attached to. So when you compare that to modern materials, it's really quite a heavy, stiff but very resilient sort of material, and of course all the closures were with press studs, so it was fairly easy to access. But again, you compare that to modern day trekkers, and it's hard not to smile politely when you see some of the gear that people bring. I would certainly rather have a modern backpack with all its padding and cushioning than a pattern 37 backpack cutting into my shoulders.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that issue. And when we did the reenactment trip back in 2017, we had the pattern 37 equipment, and one of the things that you'd have to be careful about is the brass buckles, and I'm sure you mentioned it, you can find a lot of those in the jungle, but the brass buckles are metal rubbing on your skin, again, to opening a wound, and we found ourselves having to make it so we could either make sure our clothing was in between it, or bend it out of the way, or do something that would stop it rubbing on the skin. But so people at home understand what we're talking about. We're talking about the basic of a web belt made of webbing with a brass buckle on each end that locks together, and two basic pouches, and two straps that go over the shoulders, which cross at the back, that link through on the back of the belt. Now, that's the skeleton set, wouldn't you say, Gary?
Indeed it is. What they called battle order, which is different to marching order. Marching order is a little bit more complex. It involves having a large pack. I'm just talking a large backpack which simply has one huge pocket. There's no side pockets or little openings that you tend to get lost in with modern day backpacks. But it was a large pack with greatcoats and blankets and the like. I mean, there simply wasn't the opportunity to go into marching order on the Kokoda Trail. Going back to that book, The Foot Soldiers, Bill Crooks specifically mentions the fact that they left their large packs behind and were hoping against all hope that maybe the rear echelon troops would bring their packs forward. Well, of course, that never eventuated, and they simply went over the trail with haversacks, which is a much smaller version of the large pack, and perhaps had the ability to either fix to those shoulder straps that you mentioned or be placed over the shoulder with a single strap.
Yeah, so in addition, I should say, we've missed a couple of points here. One is probably going to resonate with trekkers. They had to drink water, they had to hydrate. What was attached to their webbing in the way of something to drink with?
So the Australian troops throughout both the First and Second World War, even through to Korea, had a simple steel enamelled blue-coloured water bottle which had a woolen envelope or sleeve of which it was placed into and actually stitched into itself. One, to provide some sort of camouflage from the bright blue enamel, but two, also that offer some type of insulation, I guess. So having said that, they generally only carried one bottle. I've seen many photos of guys with these bottles slung in different positions, but mostly on the left bum cheek, if I can use that term.
Yeah.
Sorry, incorrect. Sorry, the right bum cheek, because your bayonet for a right-hander was on your left side. So having said that, David, there's one thing Kokoda is not short of, and that is water. So obviously troops had the chance to fill up at many opportunities. But having said that too, I mean, unlike modern trekkers who simply blow in through any sort of location, troops are often dug in, waiting for the enemy or forming some sort of ambush positions, or simply in the Great Army tradition, hurry up and wait.
Yes.
So having said that, troops did not have the ready access to water that we as trekkers would have. Again, due to the fact that we are simply so transient and walking through the jungle without a care. So having said that, it's literally 1 quart. The water bottles were quite small, less than 1 litre. In fact, there's a famous old movie called The 40,000 Horsemen with Chips Rafferty, and he describes it simply as being a baby's bottle.
Indeed. So here we are. We've got this webbing set with the straps, the belt, the pouches at the front, and the pouches at the front. I don't know about you, but I remember, in the army you can't have anything in the front pouches because they belong to the Queen, or in the time that we're talking, that belongs to the King. So inside your pouches at the front, I guess, were really reserved for ammunition.
Absolutely. And again, going back to what I mentioned before with regards to Sergeant B. Tong's military medal winner, he simply said that weight was the factor, with the main emphasis being placed on ammunition. At one stage, he led a 4-man patrol forward, where their main firepower was the forward scout with a Thompson submachine gun, rifle. Bede himself carrying a rifle, but again, ammunition was generally reserved, as you say, for those front pouches. There was also a system called a cotton bandolier, where a man could carry 50 rounds. Imagine a cotton bandolier with 5 pockets, and in each pocket you could fit 2 clips containing 5 rounds each. So it's 50 rounds all up. So Bede said he carried 2 of those bandoliers, 100 rounds, because simply, again, he never knew what was going to happen. They were the furthest forward at that particular stage, and we're talking around about September of 1942, as well as 36M hand grenades, or Mills bombs, they called them. So, yeah, definitely, those front 2 pouches were very much reserved for ammunition. In fact, there was very little comforts taken over the Kokoda Trail. Men, to keep warm at best, had half a blanket which was simply cut down the middle and used to warm either the upper part of your body or the lower part. So again, that's how desperate men were in trying to carry the necessities for battle, and those necessities being arms and ammunition.
So one of the parts of the equipment that they're carrying, or one of the, I guess, it's the haversack, isn't it? It's this small pack which could be put on the side, where over your bayonet, hung through the front and the rear brace, or more commonly you see them with this smaller pack worn on the back.
Indeed, yes. So normally in marching order, it would be the large pack, which is fixed using 2-inch buckles to the shoulder braces, and that sits on the upper portion of your back. But yes, certainly there's very much a great deal of photographic evidence of men putting the small pack in that position, which was quite correct. I mean, that again dates back to the '08 pattern equipment of the First World War. But again, I just think it was more practical to have the small pack on a single strap. It's the same type of strap, David, as you'd have simply suspending from your belt over to the front where your ammo pouches are. So it's generally a 1-inch strap with a 2-inch portion, which gives you a little bit of more comfort over the shoulders. But certainly the haversack was something that you needed to access, I believe, on a regular basis. It often carried 36M hand grenades, so to have it fixed on your back would have been quite difficult to grab what you needed in a hurry.
Indeed, and I'm reminded now when we talk about the equipment that the Australian soldier is wearing in relation to what modern day trekkers, and I'm sure you've as a trek leader yourself have experienced it where people rock up simply carrying so much. And I always say to people, you can't buy yourself out of putting one foot in front of the other.
No, indeed, mate, indeed. So listen, David, I know that you're going, for the benefit of the listeners, place some photographs attached to this podcast. If I can just, I might send you through a photo which you've seen before, I'm sure. It's quite a sad photo taken on the beachheads, which were fought after the Kokoda battle, where we actually pushed the Japanese into the sea. I'm talking December of 1942 through the January of 1943. And it simply shows a young soldier face down in the mud. He has distinctive blonde hair, and I would definitely assert that any parent would recognise her son, even though his face is not visible. It clearly shows the shape and style of his head, and I'm sure a parent would recognise as that person as being their son. Well, sadly, he's been killed in action, but he has the small pack fixed to his back, and it really is such a poignant photo. It's one which is not often seen. It's rarely placed in books, I guess due to its graphic nature. It doesn't show the wounds, of course, but it simply shows a man, a young Australian with simply blonde hair, face down in the mud with his kit on. And to me, it's one of the most tragic and sad photos of the Second World War. So I might send that through to you, David, and you might add that to your podcast.
Yeah, we'll add that up with the photographs. Now, let's go inside. Let's get on to the inside. It's my understanding, and you see a couple of the photographs with them, especially, and I'm thinking at Minari, I'm thinking the famous still from Damien Parra's Kokoda front line, where Ralph Honor is addressing his men after the 39th had been taken out of the battle, with obviously Brigade Hill behind it. And you and I have been there and stood in the spot to try and locate that spot. But you see them with jumpers. You see the 39th lining up, and there's quite a few soldiers in that photograph. And I actually have one of my mannequins in my study here dressed with simply the jumper on. So for people who've walked the Kokoda track, they'll know. And for those who don't know, it gets cold up there, doesn't it?
Oh, look, without a doubt in the world. In fact, you get up towards Mount Bellamy there on the Kokoda Trail, Myola Ridge and the like, especially down inside the valley as well, Dump 1 and Templeton's Crossing, and it's absolutely freezing at night. That army pullover which you talk about, it was a collarless woolen pullover. And it was very simple in its design. It was a V-shaped neck, and often you see photos of men, as you say, in particular the 39th at Minari, wearing these pullovers, and there's simply no shirt underneath. So you can imagine, the pullover would have been extremely welcome on those cold nights. And just if I can just go back a little bit, David, when we spoke about socks and Myola, it was not uncommon for troops whose socks had rotted off to cut the sleeves from those jumpers and use them as socks as a substitute.
There you go. And very similar in their construction and design, aren't they, the sleeves in relation to the socks?
Indeed. And again, we are extremely fortunate Damien Parra, or Parra, I should say, actually recorded and kept a very strong record of what troops were enduring on that trail, because that photo that you mentioned of the Minari parade where Ralph Honor is addressing his troops, it really is a wonderful snapshot of all the different types of uniform and kit, and how each man more or less adapted that kit to suit himself. Because of course, there was no parade ground inspections being done at Minari, in 1942. It was simply what was practical and what worked best for you.
So in addition to the jumper, I want us to move on to some of the more personal, and because I think it really reigns at home. And I'm looking in my cabinet now, and again, I'll put these shots up here. Australian soldiers were issued with a thing called a holdall, weren't they?
Indeed. But I wonder how many of those remained at the end of the campaign, and how many ended up in the jungle, between Owa's Corner, for example, and Irabiwa.
So for listeners who don't know what we're talking about, a holdall is a piece of cloth material that rolls out, and it has little segments in it that you can slide things through. And in a barrack room environment, I'm sure you'll agree, Gary, in a perfect world, you would have it with things like your toothbrush, your toothpaste, your shaving brush. You would have your razor and your razor blades. You'd also have a spare set of laces, and you'd have your comb to do your hair, and obviously a bar of soap. And in addition to that, you would have also had maybe a little bag that had the little brush for doing your boots, and a cloth with your boot polish on it. So how many of those actually made it across, because we're talking about weight? I don't know, Gary, you're right. It may very well have been thrown away.
Without any doubt in the world. It's very well chronicled, again, in The Foot Soldiers by Bill Crooks, and other accounts of men from the 39th Battalion, as they did their first few steps along the trail, starting to discard pieces of kit into the jungle as they walked along. So in terms of that holdall that you speak of, it was not uncommon for men to use the buddy system, and of course share a razor between 2 or 3 men. I've been told on a few occasions that the toothbrush was not just good for cleaning your teeth, but got some of the muck out of the action of your Thompson submachine gun, which was very prone to jamming whenever it was fouled up with foreign bodies. So you can imagine cleaning a Thompson submachine gun and then you brushing your teeth. It would have been a very unusual situation.
Yeah, indeed. And these things that we're talking about, I'm going to put them up in photographs so we can see that. Now, the other thing that I just want to mention is in the 9 or so minutes we've got left here. So the gas capes or rain capes, I know that there is, and we're coming up. We're in the anniversary month now in October with the battles. The biggest battle in the Owen Stanley are Yora Creek battles, and hopefully again we'll get you back on the program and we can talk about people like the Manusu brothers and the Japanese mountain gun position. But they had rain capes, and we know this because there are accounts of men near Yora Creek. They can hear the creek running, and they can't get to it because the Japanese are dominating it, and they need to get to it to get water. So they have their rain capes out, and they're actually catching water. What can you tell us about the rain cape that was carried on the men?
Yes, the rain cape is quite an interesting thing because we've spoken about weight and the I guess just the fact that these men were burdened down with such vast amounts of arms and ammunition. I mean, the rain cape itself is a rubberized cotton. It's quite a heavy object when you start to weigh things up. But again, I mean, numerous accounts of men, huddling in foxholes during the night, with their gas capes shielding the actions of their rifles and things such as that to try and keep the moisture and the mud out if they possibly could. I mean, there's many accounts of men wearing or carrying these gas capes with them, and of course, the unfortunate thing is, there's at least 1 or 2 bodies or skeletons which have been unearthed. By the erosion that you see on the Kokoda Trail, and you often see amongst the bones these eyelets, these brass eyelets,
yes,
which formed a part of those gas capes, evidence that men were wrapped in their gas capes when they were buried.
Indeed, and I'm going to put up a picture of the gas cape. So really, if you're on the Kokoda in 1942, you're a soldier. Even at the best of times, with say you're starting out, especially we mentioned the 25th Brigade, you imagine they're starting up from Moresby End, the Sageri Plateau there to march off. They are really carrying with them, on their person, most of they're wearing the only uniform. They might have a spare shirt or their jumper in their haversack. And really all they've got is a blanket, a full blanket at best, but at most likely, as you say, half a wool blanket. And again, we'll put a picture of the wool blanket up. And their rain cape. So really, and maybe some spare socks and whatever bits and pieces they've taken out of their holdall. You often see men unshaven, so it's not like they were shaving every day. It would have been quite terrible up in the high country to go to sleep at night, wouldn't it?
Oh, it would have been amazing. In fact, there was, as you know, probably very, very little sleep, I'm sorry to say. For the people who have not walked Kokoda yet, you'll note that the Australians had a buddy system. I mentioned before 2 men sharing a razor, for example. The Australian weapon pits were a rectangular shaped pit, so 2 men, to 1 weapons pit. I don't know whether the buddy system would allow at all stages for one to sleep and one to stay awake, but certainly I've often heard of sleepless nights where both would stay awake, or the rain was such that kept them awake, and there was nothing they could do about that. Compare that to the Japanese holes, weapons pitch, I should say, because the term foxhole doesn't really relate to us at that time period. So the Japanese had a single-man weapons pit. The Australian had a dual-man buddy system for their weapons pits. So without a doubt in the world, men would share bits and pieces. I've got no doubt that the holdalls that you mentioned before were certainly shared about or halved, so that one man would carry a piece and another man would carry the other parts. But often you'd hear about troops, again in that two-man buddy system, sitting in a foxhole and sharing one tin of bully beef, for example. So you can imagine if they only had one tin of bully to last them the entire day, you would open one tin and share that for lunch, and then open the second tin and share the same meal for the evening. So without any doubt in the world, the Australian soldier, I think, has had that buddy system well before what we use now in the modern Australian Army, and it's just a common sense way to operate. Two men, two brains, two fingers on a trigger are better than one. So without doubt in the world, I mean, Australians learnt a lot through these campaigns. And I've never been to the Conungra Jungle Training School, but I'm sure there's still a lot of lessons there from Kokoda being taught to our modern day diggers.
Harry, it's interesting that you mention about them discarding things that weren't required, like your toothbrush and things that, half a blanket, all of this stuff to cut down the weight. And I'm reminded now of a wonderful interview that was done some time ago now with a 6th Division veteran that was on the Kokoda track, a bloke named Fred Westphal. And let's have a listen at what Fred has to say about carrying his equipment on Kokoda.
Naturally, we only carried a couple of tins, which you drank out of, ate out of, and never had a ground sheet, a blanket, your rifle and bullets, a knapsack to put the ground sheet in. You didn't have a fire, you couldn't light a fire, so you didn't have a hot cup of tea or anything. I used to get the bark off to clean my teeth with the bark. Because there's no toothpaste or toothbrushes. Are you going to carry toothbrush and things? You think what you're going to carry. You got to carry it.
Yeah, right.
You got to carry it night and day.
To close on the equipment that the Australian, because I haven't, as you notice, the listener will notice, we've not gone into the weapons, which is something that I'd like to do on a later program. But, the Australian soldier obviously were carrying their main battle weapon, which is the Lee Enfield Mark III 303 rifle, and their sword bayonet, which we briefly mentioned, and we'll come back to those later. But obviously, when I did the reenactment trip and we carried the 303 rifles, there was a lot of the time where it actually just became a hassle, and you wish, when you trek at any other time, Gary, you appreciate that we don't have, other than a walking pole, you don't really have anything in your hand. But to close off on the equipment, there are two items which every soldier, I'm sure, would have not wanted to be without. And those two items are their dog tags, I guess they're colloquial known, but their identification discs, and of course their paybook. What can you tell us about those, Gary?
Okay, well, the identification discs, and again, I mean, people colloquially call them dog tags. That's not an expression we used in 1942. It's certainly very much an American term. So the identity discs were something which obviously was on the person at all times. And they form two parts. There's a portion which was to remain with the body if ever a man was killed in action or unfortunately didn't quite make it. He would have a tag remain with his body during the burial process. And the second tag would be taken by either his officer or his section commander or even his mate, and that tag would be taken back and entered into his personal effects and sent back to the family, generally speaking. So the identity disc contained things such as his name, his blood type, his religion, for example. Often you see METH for Methodist or RC for Roman Catholic and things such as that. So the identity discs were something which were certainly an essential part of any soldier's kit, for identification purposes. And they came in two different types. The general issue pressed fibre, I think it's short, but one was green and one would have their own personal. And you'd often see those hand engraved, so they weren't government issue to start with. So our discs were something which generally remained around our neck, and often the way of wearing those discs was with a simple leather fob, which is just like a shoelace, a leather type shoelace. So that was one item which a troop could be identified by, and the second one, as you mentioned, was the paybook. There's a famous story, as you know, about Breton Langridge, which perhaps you might like to share with your listeners, and the fact that he may have handed over one of his paybooks or his paybook to another fellow officer before an attack. David, would you like to elaborate on that?
Glad that you bring up the story of Brenton Langridge at Brigade Hill, and like me, you tell it to all the trekkers that you take over there. But instead of hearing the story from my mouth, let's hear it from the mouth of the late, great Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor.
Particularly think of blokes like Lefty Langridge and Claude Nye, one with a company of the 2nd 16th and one with a company of the 2nd 14th, who were ordered to go around the right flank where the bulk of the Japanese were to try and force a way through them to Brigade Hill. They knew they couldn't do it. They knew they were going to die. Langridge handed over his paybook and his dog tags to one of his mates. He was a brave soldier. So was Claude Nye. They were both killed. Actually, out of the two companies, about 6 men got through.
Yeah, so we all hear about, and I can think of several stories, but of Brenton Langridge, for the listeners who haven't been over Kokoda, and if they've been, I'm sure with either Gary or myself, you would have recalled the story. But Brenton Langridge was involved in what they call the bayonet attack at the Saddle. So for those who've been up to Brigade Hill, you would know that in the course of the battle that the Japanese broke through, obviously, to try and get through to the Australians. And in order for the Australians to withdraw from that feature, a lot of men gave up their lives in defence to do that. And the story, and men like Charlie McCullum, I should say, which is a great story that we're going to tell later on in this series. But Brenton Langridge reportedly handed over his identity discs and his paybook because he knew he wasn't going to survive and go in against the Japanese. And you know, to do that, I guess, to give up those possessions, they're the one few possessions that if you were to give them up, you know you weren't coming back.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, that fortunately, Brenton Langridge fell on the battlefield. When the 25th Brigade came back through the following month, allegedly his body was identified. So having said that, to remove one disc and keep one on the body reinforces what I mentioned before. You can imagine the state of decomposition which would have been experienced then of the bodies left unburied on top of Brigade Hill. I mean, the Japanese cremated their own, but left our bodies in situ, the Australian bodies in situ. So again, much of them would have just simply been skeletonized, but very sad. So those identity discs are a very important part of the soldier's kit. Can I just go on a side issue there, David? Since I've started trekking, and I trekked with you way back in 2007, is I've been carrying a set of discs to a 2nd 27th soldier. For those of your listeners who don't know the battalion designations, the 2nd 27th is South Australia's proud battalion. And the man who I'm about to talk about is a chap named Hubert Ian Manser, spelled Manser. And Hubert Ian Manser was a chap who I guess devoted himself to going out and trying to save the lives of his mates, or at least give those who were in their last moments some sort of comfort in the shape of morphine or something similar. So I carry with myself a set of identification discs which bear his name, and I purchased them of all places on eBay. You mentioned before medals gone missing, where we get medals and items back to the respective families. This is one set of dog tags or identity discs, I should say, which we will be getting back to the family once I finish my trekking career. But Hubert Ian Manser was awarded the military medal for his actions on Brigade Hill on the 7th September 1942, where he actually went out and administered morphine to a chap who was mortally wounded, and brought some level of comfort in his final moments. So I'm very pleased to say these tags are likely the ones that Hubert Ian Manser was wearing in September of 1942 on Brigade Hill. So it's something I carry with me on every trek, and I show them to our trekkers. And it just really is a humbling thing to be able to carry a small piece of that man on the trail that was likely there over 76 years ago.
Indeed, it's a wonderful story. Well, look, Gary, thanks so much for coming on Kokoda Cast. I look forward to having you back on the show later on down the track, where I'm sure we'll talk about 100 different things to do with Kokoda, and it's been a fascinating insight into what the guys, the Australian soldiers, I should say, carried. My last question for you on this is, if you were back in 1942, Gary, and you had to choose between any piece of that personal kit, for foregoing the dog tags and the paybook, because that was a given, what would be the one item you think you would want to have then, and does it relate to one item that you would have now?
Well, that's really a hard question, David, because my first thought then when you said that was vitamin 3B chafing cream.
You're not going to get that in 1942.
No, we certainly aren't. I do believe, though, there was petroleum jelly. But if I could just finish on this note, that those hard cotton uniforms that we mentioned earlier in your program, there is absolutely no mention in any history that I've ever read of the worry or the problem of chafing, and chafing is something I've battled. I've done 22 crossings, which is nowhere near the amount you've done, but each and every trip I've done, I've chafed on each and every trip, and so finally vitamin 3B cream is the one I must do the trek with, because it's an embarrassing yet a very afflicting injury that is just completely useless. I don't know why the human body decided to invent chafing as an ailment, but look, I guess if I had to carry any object on the trail, it would have to be a slouch hat. It would have to be the khaki fur felt hat. Simply being the sun in New Guinea is biting, and I just think the slouch hat, as iconic as it is, was a wonderful object for the tropics, and not only kept out the sun, but kept the rain off you at 3 o'clock in the morning when you were sitting in your weapons pit as well. So yeah, without a doubt, it'd be the iconic slouch hat, I think, David.
Well, thanks again, Gary. Really appreciate it. And listeners back home, this has just been the first of we haven't been able to cover all the gear, but this is the first time that we've given to it on the podcast. But we'll be back later on with lots of different things, including, which I know people may listening think that we've forgotten about, but we haven't, which is the messing equipment. But I'm going to deal with that in a latter edition, which talks about the food, and we'll talk about the Dixies, the mess tins, and all that sort of stuff. So Gary, thanks again. Really appreciate it, and we'll have you back on again.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.